The rise and fall of Egypt, pharaohs, pyramids, the cult of the afterlife, wars with the Hittites and the Sea Peoples. Egypt is called the gift of the Nile. This is not just a beautiful expression by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, but an accurate description of the essence of this civilization's existence. The great river, which flooded annually and left fertile silt on its banks, made agriculture possible in a region surrounded by a merciless desert. Thanks to the Nile, one of the world's most ancient and magnificent civilizations arose in the valley. As early as the 4th millennium BC, tribes of farmers and cattle breeders lived on the banks of the Nile. Gradually, they began to unite into communities and then into larger formations. First, two kingdoms appeared, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, closer to the Mediterranean Sea. Their symbols were the white and red crowns. For a long time, these lands competed with each other, but around 3100 BC, an event occurred that became a turning point in the country's history. King Nama, also known as Menes, united the two kingdoms into a single state. Thus began the era of the pharaohs. The pharaoh was considered more than just a king. He was a living god, the son of Ra, the sun god. His power extended not only to people but also to nature itself. The flooding of the Nile, the harvests, and the fate of the entire nation depended on him. People believed that if the pharaoh was strong and just, the country would prosper. But, if he was weak, misfortune would ensue. The Age of Pyramids. During the Old Kingdom, 27th, 22nd centuries BC, Egypt experienced its first great flowering. The country became a centralized state, with a powerful bureaucracy and a developed economy. It was then that the majestic pyramids, symbols of power and faith, appeared. The first step pyramid was built for Pharaoh Djoser by the architect Imhotep. It was a grandiose innovation. Instead of the usual mastabas rectangular tombs, a giant stone structure reaching for the sky appeared. Subsequent rulers went even further. The pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, Snefru, Cheops, Khafre, and Menkaure, built pyramids in Giza. The Great Pyramid of Cheops is particularly impressive. More than 2 million stone blocks, each weighing several tons, were stacked so precisely that not even a knife blade can fit between them. To this day, this structure remains one of the 7 wonders of the world. The pyramids were not just tombs, they were the embodiment of the Egyptians' belief in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that the human soul was immortal and continued to exist after death. But for this to happen, the body had to be preserved. This gave rise to the practice of mummification, a complex ritual that involved removing the organs, treating the body with special resins, and wrapping it in linen bandages. The mummy was placed in a sarcophagus, and everything that the deceased might need in the afterlife was placed next to it: food, jewelry, weapons, and ushabti figurines, which were supposed to work for their owner in the other world. The pharaohs built grandiose tombs not only for themselves. They asserted their immortality and showed their subjects that their power was divine and eternal. The construction of the pyramids required enormous effort. Thousands of workers and craftsmen labored for years, but contrary to myths, these were not slaves, but free peasants, who were called upon to build during the flooding of the Nile, when the fields were under water and agriculture came to a standstill. Entire cities of builders sprang up around the pyramids. There were bakeries, breweries, and workshops. Egyptian society was clearly organized, and each person had their place in this system. The first collapse. However, the greatness of the Old Kingdom proved short-lived. By the end of the 22nd century BC, difficulties began. The Nile floods became less abundant, and harvests declined. Centralized power weakened, and the nobility strengthened its position. Civil strife began. The country broke up into many nomes, or regions, each with its own ruler. This period, is called the First Intermediate Period. Famine, turmoil, and devastation. This was the state of Egypt at that time, but it was then that the influence of religion grew stronger. People sought solace in faith. The Middle Kingdom. Around 2050 BC, Pharaoh Mentuhotep II managed to unite the country and laid the foundation for the Middle Kingdom. This era became a time of revival. The country regained stability, agriculture and crafts developed, and irrigation canals were built. The pharaohs strengthened the army and began an active foreign policy. The Egyptians penetrated south into Nubia, rich in gold. They traded with eastern countries, importing incense, copper, and rare woods. Culture also flourished. Egyptian scribes created literary works such as the Teachings of Ptahhotep and The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant. New realistic motifs appeared in art. However, this kingdom was not eternal either. Gradually, power weakened again, and the country suffered a new blow. The invasion of the Hyksos. Around the 17th century BC, the Hyksos tribes, nomads from the Middle East, invaded Egypt. They brought with them new technologies, horses, chariots, and composite bows. The Egyptians, accustomed to fighting with foot soldiers, were powerless. The Hyksos captured the Nile Delta and ruled there for about 100 years. For the Egyptians, this was humiliating. Foreigners sat on their throne. But in Upper Egypt, independent rulers remained, who gradually gained strength. The victory over the Hyksos was a turning point. The pharaohs of the 17th dynasty managed to expel the invaders, and King Yahmos I finally cleansed the country. Thus began a new era, the New Kingdom, 16th–11th centuries BC. This period became the golden age of Egypt. The state expanded its borders, the army became a powerful force, and culture and art reached unprecedented heights. The pharaohs of this era went down in history as some of the most famous. Thutmose III, the Egyptian Napoleon. Thutmose III occupies a special place. He is called the greatest conqueror of Egypt. He ruled in the 15th century BC and led 17 military campaigns. The Egyptian army reached the banks of the Euphrates and subjugated Palestine and Syria. The country became a world superpower, controlling trade and tribute from vast territories. Under Thutmose III, the army became a professional force. The Egyptians mastered chariots and established mass production of weapons. The captured cities paid tribute in gold, silver, wood, and incense. Wealth flowed into Egypt, which allowed for the construction of temples and palaces. Karnak became the main temple center, where grandiose pylons, obelisks, and columned halls were erected. Thutmose III ordered a chronicle of his campaigns to be carved on the walls, a kind of military diary that has survived to this day. The female pharaoh Hatshepsut. Before Thutmose III, the country was ruled by Hatshepsut, one of the few female pharaohs. She wore a male headdress and was even depicted with a false beard. But her reign went down in history, not for wars, but for peace and construction. Hatshepsut launched trade expeditions to Punt, a mysterious land from which gold, ivory, and rare incense were brought. She built a magnificent temple in Deir el-Bahari, which still stands today. Attempts were made to erase her name from history. For a long time, her successors knocked down images and destroyed inscriptions. But the greatness of her deeds has survived the test of time. Akhenaten and Nefertiti. In the 14th century BC, Egypt was shaken by a religious revolution. Pharaoh Amenhotep IV decided to change the very foundation of the Egyptian faith. He proclaimed the sun disk, Aten, to be the supreme and only god. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning pleasing to Aten. Akhenaten moved the capital to the new city of Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna. The temples of the old gods were closed, and the priesthood of Amun was stripped of its power. This was the first experiment in the history of monotheism. At Akhenaten's side stood his great wife Nefertiti. Her image has been preserved in the famous bust, one of the most famous monuments of antiquity. But the reform proved short-lived. After Akhenaten's death, his successors, including the young Tutankhamun, restored the old religion. Akhenaten was abandoned, and attempts were made to erase Akhenaten's name from history. Tutankhamun. Although Tutankhamun ruled for a short time and was himself a young king, his name became a symbol, not because of his deeds, but because of his tomb. It was almost untouched by looters and preserved incredible treasures: a golden sarcophagus, a throne, and jewelry. In the 20th century, its discovery by archaeologist Howard Carter shook the world. Thanks to this forgotten pharaoh, Egypt shone again after 3,000 years. Ramses II and the war with the Hittites. The most famous king of the New Kingdom was Ramses II, the Great. He ruled for over 60 years, 13th century BC, and left behind dozens of temples, statues, and inscriptions. His images can be found throughout the country, in Luxor, Abu Simbel, and Karnak. The main event of his reign was the war with the Hittites, the strongest power in Asia Minor. The Battle of Kadesh, around 1274 BC, was one of the largest in the ancient world. The Egyptians and Hittites brought out thousands of chariots and warriors. The battle ended without a decisive victory. Both sides suffered heavy losses. But it was after this battle that the first written peace treaty in world history was concluded, the Treaty of Ramses and Hattusili. The gods of both countries swore an oath on it, and it ensured a long period of peace. Ramses II became famous as a builder. His temples amazed the imagination of his contemporaries. The complex at Abu Simbel, carved into the rock, is particularly grandiose. Huge statues of the pharaoh greeted travelers, reminding them that they were in the presence of the ruler of the world. Prosperity and wealth. The New Kingdom reached its zenith. Egypt controlled lands from Nubia to Syria. Wealth, gold, slaves, and exotic goods flowed into the country. The temples of Amun in Karnak and Luxor were transformed into huge complexes, and the priests became increasingly influential. Culture flourished, works of literature were created, and art reached new heights of sophistication. The walls of tombs were painted with scenes of hunting and celebrations, depicting the heavens and the afterlife. Scribes recorded events and created archives. It seemed that Egypt had become eternal. But prosperity is always followed by decline. By the end of the 13th century BC, Egypt's power began to waver. Outwardly, its grandeur remained intact. Temples were built, campaigns were conducted, and priests grew rich. But internally, the state was gradually losing its strength. The pharaohs spent enormous resources on construction and wars, and the country's economy began to weaken. The fields were depleted, the peasantry became poorer, and taxes increased. The priesthood of Amun gained more and more power, concentrating vast lands and wealth in their hands. The pharaohs became hostages of their own elite. Sea peoples. The main blow came in the form of invasions by the so-called Sea peoples. These mysterious tribes, whose origins are still disputed, descended on the eastern Mediterranean in the 13th–12th centuries BC. They destroyed cities, attacked the coast, and brought chaos and fire. During the reign of Ramses III, Egypt faced their onslaught. In 1177 BC, a decisive battle took place. The Sea peoples approached the Nile Delta. Ramses managed to assemble an army and a fleet, and the battle took place directly on the water. The Egyptians used a ruse. They lured the enemy into the narrow mouth of the Nile and rained arrows and spears down on them. The enemies were defeated. But the victory turned out to be Pyrrhic. Egypt had exhausted its last reserves of strength. The economy collapsed, villages were deserted, and trade died out. The Sea Peoples, even though defeated, undermined the entire region. At the same time, the Hittite Empire fell, and the cities of Syria and Palestine were destroyed. Egypt survived, but lost its influence and power. The decline of the New Kingdom. After Ramses III, the power of the pharaohs rapidly declined. Dynastic crises, intrigues, and conspiracies began. Part of the country effectively came under the control of the priests of Thebes, who ruled as independent rulers. Many tombs in the Valley of the Kings were looted. Even the mummies of the great pharaohs were taken out of their sarcophagi and hidden in secret storerooms to protect them from thieves. The country, which had once held the entire region in fear, was now barely coping with its internal problems. The Third Intermediate Period. By the 11th century BC, Egypt had split. The pharaohs of Tanis ruled in the north, and the priests of Thebes ruled in the south. Later, power passed from hand to hand. First the Libyans came, then the Kushites from Nubia, who founded the 25th dynasty. Even foreign rulers tried to look like true pharaohs. They built temples, wore crowns, and honored ancient customs. But all this could not restore the former glory. Egypt became an arena of struggle between foreigners, its riches attracting all its neighbors, the Assyrians and Persians. In the 7th century BC, Egypt faced a new threat, Assyria. The formidable army of King Ashurbanipal invaded the country, cities were destroyed, and the pharaohs were turned into vassals. Although the Egyptians tried to restore their independence, the forces were unequal. In the 6th century BC, Persia entered the arena. The great king Cambyses II conquered Egypt and incorporated it into his empire. Egyptian priests and nobles were subordinate to Persian satraps. Alexander the Great. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great entered Egyptian territory. He was greeted not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Persian rule was hated. The priests recognized Alexander as pharaoh, and he even went to the oasis of Siwa, where the oracle of Amun declared him the Son of God. Alexander founded a new city, Alexandria, which was destined to become one of the greatest centers of the ancient world. After his death, Egypt fell to the Ptolemaic dynasty, Greek kings who ruled for more than 3 centuries. The most famous was Cleopatra VII, a woman who first captivated Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony. But her struggle with Rome ended in defeat. Roman province. In 30 BC, Egypt finally lost its independence and became a province of the Roman Empire. Augustus declared the country his own possession. Senators could not even visit it without the emperor's permission. The pyramids, temples, and mummies amazed the Romans. Egypt became Rome's breadbasket. Grain from the banks of the Nile fed hundreds of thousands of residents of the capital. But its former greatness was gone. Egypt had gone from being a great power to a province of a foreign empire. Egyptian civilization did not disappear completely, even when the country lost its independence. What the pharaohs and their people had created over 3,000 years proved so strong and vivid that it survived all conquests, crises, and downfalls. Faith and the afterlife. The basis of the Egyptian worldview was a belief in eternity. The Egyptians believed that human life was only part of the journey, and that after death, a person continued to exist in the afterlife. But for this to happen, it was necessary to preserve the body and perform the correct rituals. This led to the development of mummification, the complex art of preserving the body. Priests removed the internal organs, placed them in special canopic jars, impregnated the body with resins, and wrapped it in hundreds of meters of linen bandages. Spells were recited over the mummy, and everything necessary was placed in the tomb: food, weapons, jewelry, and Ushabti figurines, which were supposed to work for their owner in the afterlife. The Book of the Dead played a special role, scrolls with spells and instructions that were placed in the tomb. It described the soul's journey through the afterlife, meeting the gods, the judgment of Osiris, weighing the heart on the scales of Maat. If a person's heart was pure, it balanced the feather of truth, and the soul went to the paradise fields of Ialu. If it outweighed the feather, it was devoured by the monster Amat. This belief shaped the whole society. The Egyptians built temples, pyramids, and tombs not only for earthly power but also for eternity, gods, and magic. The Egyptian pantheon was rich and complex. Ra was the sun god, Osiris was the lord of the underworld, Isis was the goddess of motherhood and magic, Horus was the falcon of the sky, and Anubis was the guide of souls. Magic was part of everyday life. Spells were recited during illness, construction, and childbirth. Even the pharaoh, considered a god on earth, needed rituals and priests to maintain the cosmic order, Ma'at. Violating Ma'at meant chaos, which threatened to destroy the whole world. Legacy. Even when Egypt became a province of Rome, its culture continued to live on. The Romans admired the pyramids, built obelisks in their cities, and copied statues. Egyptian priests continued to preserve secret knowledge, and Alexandria became the largest scientific center of the ancient world. Later, in the Middle Ages, Egypt became part of the Arab world, and Muslim scholars studied the legacy of the pharaohs with interest. But the writings themselves, hieroglyphs, were forgotten. Their meaning was lost for 1,500 years until Jean-François Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone in the 19th century. Since then, Egyptology has become a separate science. Archaeologists have discovered tombs, temples, and statues. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in the 20th century caused a sensation. Egypt spoke to the world again, a symbol of eternity. The history of Egypt is a story of ups and downs, of greatness and crises. This civilization lasted longer than any other, 3,000 years of continuous history, more than the time from ancient Rome to the present day. Egypt has survived dozens of dynasties, foreign invaders, crises, and disasters, but it has left behind a legacy that still amazes people today. The pyramids of Giza, the temples of Luxor, the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, the mummies of the pharaohs, the golden masks, and the sarcophagi, all of these have become symbols of humanity's desire for eternity. Even the fall of Egypt did not destroy its greatness. Romans, Arabs, Europeans, all admired this country and tried to touch its secrets. And today, when we look at the pyramids, we see not just stones laid by ancient people, but a message from the depths of centuries, evidence that man has always sought to conquer time. Epilogue. The rise and fall of Egypt is not just the story of one country. It is a story of how a civilization can soar to the heavens, create wonders, survive for centuries, and then fall under the blows of enemies and internal weaknesses. But at the same time, it is a story of the immortality of culture. The pharaohs have long since turned into mummies, their kingdoms have disappeared, and empires have replaced one another. But Egypt remains as a symbol of eternity, mystery, and grandeur. And as long as the pyramids stand, as long as the golden mask of Tutankhamun shines, the world will remember the civilization that was the first to show that man can build eternity.